1907. An asylum patient's portrait was found. But then they noticed the eyes. That's exactly what we're talking about today, and I promise you this story will make you question everything you think you know about old photographs and the secrets they can hide. Dr. Margaret Chen had spent 15 years working as an archivist at the National Medical History Institute in downtown Chicago. She thought she had seen everything during her career. Old medical records, disturbing surgical photographs, countless patient files from bygone eras, and documentation of medical practices that would horrify modern doctors. Nothing surprised her anymore. That was until she opened a dusty cardboard box marked Riverside State Hospital, 1907, on a cold Tuesday morning in March. The box contained dozens of patient portraits, each one carefully labeled with a name and date written in faded blue ink. These photographs weren't unusual in Margaret's line of work. Mental institutions from the early 1900s often photographed their patients for medical records and identification purposes. Margaret had cataloged hundreds of similar collections over the years, each one telling its own sad story of human suffering and primitive medical care. She pulled out the first photograph and glanced at it briefly before setting it aside to continue her systematic documentation process. The patient was a young woman, maybe 25 years old, with pale skin that suggested she hadn't seen sunlight in months. Her name was written on the back in careful penmanship. Eleanor Whitmore, admitted September 15, 1907. The photograph showed Eleanor sitting rigidly in a wooden chair against a plain white backdrop that was standard for institutional photography. Her dark hair was neatly arranged in the Gibson girl style popular during that era, and she wore a simple gray dress that was regulation attire for asylum patients. At first glance, there was absolutely nothing remarkable about the portrait at all. Margaret continued sorting through the other photographs, making detailed notes in her leather-bound ledger and creating digital catalog entries for each image. The routine work usually helped her focus, but something kept drawing her attention back to Eleanor's portrait like a magnet. She picked it up again and studied it more carefully under the bright desk lamp. That's when she noticed something genuinely disturbing about Eleanor's eyes. They weren't looking directly at the camera like every other patient portrait she had ever examined. Instead, Eleanor's gaze seemed to be fixed intently on something just over the photographer's left shoulder, as if she was watching an invisible presence in the room. Her facial expression was unnaturally calm, almost serene, but there was a burning intensity in those dark eyes that made Margaret deeply uncomfortable. More medically disturbing was the fact that Eleanor's pupils appeared to be dramatically different sizes. One was completely normal, while the other was significantly larger and more dilated, giving her entire face an unsettling asymmetry that suggested serious neurological damage. Margaret had studied enough medical photography during her graduate training to know that unequal pupils could indicate a serious brain injury, stroke, or severe neurological condition. But there was something else about Eleanor's eyes that she couldn't quite identify or explain. They seemed to hold a deep knowledge, a forbidden awareness that didn't match the typical vacant stare of severely mentally ill patients from that brutal time period. It was as if Eleanor was seeing something that existed beyond the normal range of human perception. Curious about Eleanor's story, Margaret decided to research her background. She accessed the Institute's digital archives and searched for any records related to Riverside State Hospital. What she found was surprisingly sparse. Most of the hospital's records had supposedly been destroyed in a fire in 1952. Only a few scattered documents remained. Margaret managed to find one brief admission note for Eleanor Whitmore. The document stated that she had been committed by her family after displaying episodes of violent behavior and claims of supernatural communication. The attending physician was listed as Dr. Harrison Blackwood, but no additional medical notes were attached to the file. The lack of information only deepened Margaret's interest. She spent her lunch break researching Dr. Blackwood online. According to medical journals from the early 1900s, Harrison Blackwood had been a pioneer in experimental psychiatric treatments. His methods were considered controversial even by the standards of his time. Several medical ethics boards had investigated his practices, but no formal charges were ever filed. Margaret returned to Eleanor's photograph with fresh eyes. She used a magnifying glass to examine every detail of the image. The longer she stared at Eleanor's face, the more unsettled she became. There was definitely something wrong with those eyes, but it went beyond the unequal pupils. The iris of Eleanor's left eye appeared to have an unusual pattern, almost like tiny symbols or markings embedded in the colored tissue. She scanned the photograph at high resolution and zoomed in on Eleanor's eyes on her computer screen. What she saw made her gasp. The markings in Eleanor's iris weren't natural variations in pigmentation. They looked deliberate, almost like they had been carved or burned into the eye itself. The pattern was geometric and precise, resembling symbols she had never seen before. Margaret's hands shook as she printed out the enlarged image. She showed it to her colleague, Dr. James Morrison, who worked in the medical artifacts department. James examined the photograph with his own equipment and confirmed Margaret's suspicions. The markings in Eleanor's eye were definitely artificial, though he had no idea how they could have been created in 1907. That evening, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor Whitmore and the haunting quality of her photograph. She researched everything she could find about experimental eye procedures from the early 1900s, diving deep into medical journals and historical archives. Most of what she discovered involved crude attempts at treating cataracts and glaucoma using primitive surgical techniques. Nothing came close to explaining the precise geometric markings embedded in Eleanor's iris, and certainly nothing that could account for the otherworldly quality in her gaze. She decided to visit the site where Riverside State Hospital once stood, hoping to uncover additional clues about Eleanor's mysterious case. The building had been demolished in the 1970s during urban renewal efforts, but Margaret hoped she might find some local residents who remembered stories about the place and its notorious reputation. The hospital had been located in a small rural town called Millbrook, about 2 hours outside the city, nestled in rolling hills that had once seemed perfect for mental health treatment. Margaret drove to the town on Saturday morning. The site where the hospital had stood was now occupied by a shopping mall, but she found several elderly residents at a local diner who remembered the old asylum. Most of their stories were typical tales of a creepy abandoned building that teenagers dared each other to visit. But one elderly man named Frank had a different story to tell. Frank's grandfather had worked as a groundskeeper at Riverside State Hospital in the early 1900s. According to family stories passed down through generations, Dr. Blackwood had conducted secret experiments on certain patients. These weren't just medical procedures, but something much more sinister. Frank's grandfather had claimed that some patients were changed in ways that went beyond mental treatment. Margaret showed Frank the photograph of Eleanor Whitmore. The old man's face went pale when he saw it. He told Margaret that his grandfather had described patients with marked eyes who seemed to see things that weren't there. These patients were kept in a separate wing of the hospital and were never allowed visitors. Frank's story sent chills down Margaret's spine, but she needed more concrete evidence. She returned to the Institute on Monday morning, determined to find additional documentation about Dr. Blackwood's work. She expanded her search to include medical journals, newspaper archives, and government records from the early 1900s. After days of exhaustive searching through multiple databases and archives, Margaret discovered a deeply disturbing pattern that sent chills down her spine. Several mental institutions across the country had reported similar experimental procedures during exactly the same time period between 1905 and 1908. All were connected to doctors who had either studied under or maintained regular correspondence with Harrison Blackwood. The procedures seemed to involve systematically marking or surgically altering patients' eyes in some way, though the exact methods and purposes were never documented in any official medical records that survived. Margaret found one particularly chilling account in a 1909 medical journal. A doctor in Pennsylvania had written about patients who claimed they could see beyond the veil after undergoing Blackwood's experimental treatments. These patients described visions of otherworldly entities and claimed they could communicate with beings from another dimension. The more Margaret researched, the more she realized that Eleanor Whitmore's case wasn't isolated. There had been dozens, possibly hundreds, of patients who had undergone similar procedures. All of them had eventually disappeared from hospital records without explanation. It was as if they had simply vanished from existence. Margaret decided to have Eleanor's photograph examined by a forensic photography expert. Dr. Sarah Reynolds specialized in analyzing historical images for authenticity and had worked on several high-profile cases involving potentially doctored photographs. Dr. Reynolds spent several hours examining the image under various lighting conditions and magnifications. Her conclusion was startling. The photograph was completely authentic and had not been altered or manipulated in any way. The markings in Eleanor's eye were really there when the picture was taken in 1907. This confirmation made Margaret even more determined to uncover the truth about Eleanor's fate. She contacted genealogy websites and historical societies, trying to trace Eleanor Whitmore's family history. What she discovered was deeply unsettling. Eleanor had been the daughter of a wealthy industrialist who had donated significant amounts of money to Riverside State Hospital. Her commitment to the asylum had come shortly after she had begun claiming that she could see shadow people who were trying to communicate with her. Her family had initially sought help from several prominent physicians, but Eleanor's condition had only worsened over time. According to family records, Eleanor had described the shadow people in great detail. She claimed they existed in a parallel dimension that overlapped with our world. She said they were trying to warn humanity about a coming catastrophe, but they needed human intermediaries to communicate their message. Eleanor believed she had been chosen as one of these intermediaries. Margaret found Eleanor's own words in a letter she had written to her sister shortly before her commitment. The letter described how the shadow people had appeared to her in dreams at first, then began manifesting in her waking hours. Eleanor wrote that she could see them more clearly each day, and that they were becoming increasingly urgent in their attempts to communicate. The letter ended with a chilling statement. "They have promised to help me see them more clearly. Dr. Blackwood says there is a procedure that will open my eyes to their world permanently. I am frightened, dear sister, but I believe this may be the only way to understand what they are trying to tell us." Margaret realized that Eleanor had volunteered for Dr. Blackwood's experimental procedure. She hadn't been a victim of medical abuse, but a willing participant in something far more mysterious and terrifying. Further research revealed that Dr. Blackwood himself had disappeared in late 1907, around the same time that Eleanor and several other patients had vanished from hospital records. The official explanation was that Blackwood had suffered a mental breakdown and had been committed to another institution, but Margaret couldn't find any evidence to support this claim. She discovered one final piece of the puzzle in a private collection of medical documents that had been donated to the Institute years earlier. Hidden among routine correspondence was a letter from Dr. Blackwood to a colleague, dated just days before his disappearance. In the letter, Blackwood described his successful completion of the eye-marking procedure on several patients. He wrote that the subjects could now perceive the shadow realm with perfect clarity. However, he also noted that the patients had begun exhibiting disturbing behavioral changes. They spoke in unison, as if they were receiving the same messages from an external source. Most troubling, they had begun predicting future events with uncanny accuracy. Blackwood's final words in the letter were, "I fear I have opened a door that cannot be closed." The patients are no longer entirely human, and I suspect the shadow entities are using them for purposes we cannot comprehend. I must find a way to reverse the procedure before it is too late. Margaret now understood the full horror of what had happened at Riverside State Hospital. Dr. Blackwood had indeed succeeded in allowing his patients to see into another dimension, but the results had been catastrophic. Eleanor and the other marked patients had become conduits for entities from the shadow realm, and their disappearance suggested that something had gone terribly wrong. The most disturbing realization came when Margaret looked at Eleanor's photograph one final time. Using her new knowledge of the case, she noticed details that had escaped her attention before. Eleanor's serene expression wasn't the result of mental illness or medication. It was the look of someone who was no longer entirely present in our world. Margaret made copies of all her research and stored them in multiple secure locations. She had learned enough about the case to know that certain truths were meant to remain hidden. The original photograph of Eleanor Whitmore was returned to the archives, but Margaret couldn't forget those marked eyes and what they represented. As she filed her final report on the Riverside State Hospital collection, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the corner of Eleanor's photograph, barely visible, in the shadow behind her chair, was the outline of a figure that definitely wasn't there when Margaret first examined the image. The shadow figure appeared to be reaching toward Eleanor, and its face, though indistinct, seemed to be looking directly at the camera. Margaret realized that the shadow entities weren't confined to the past. They were still here, still watching, still waiting for someone else to open the door between worlds. She quickly locked the photograph away and decided never to speak of her discoveries again. But late at night, when she's working alone in the archives, Margaret sometimes feels like she's being watched. And sometimes, just sometimes, she catches glimpses of shadow figures in her peripheral vision, figures that disappear the moment she turns to look at them directly. Some doors should never be opened. Some truths are too dangerous to uncover, and some portraits hide secrets that were meant to stay buried forever. If you found this story as unsettling as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden mysteries from history's darkest corners.